Frank Smith, and I am the national coordinator of NEADS. And I welcome you to today's NEADS community engagement event. We're very fortunate to have with us Ravi Malhotra and Benjamin Isitt. They're here to talk about their just released book through UBC Press, Able to Lead: Disablement, Radicalism, and the Political Life of E.T. Kingsley. And I can tell you that it's a fantastic book. I have my own personal copy right here that I purchased, and I've almost finished reading it. It's really beautifully written and wonderfully researched, and it really is our great pleasure and thrill to have Ravi and Ben here to be authors of the book to talk about this great work, which I think contributes a lot to the field of critical disability studies and is really quite outstanding. So now what I'm going to do is turn the meeting over briefly to Carly Fox, who's a NEADS researcher, and Carly will do a land acknowledgement.
Awesome, thank you, Frank. As a settler on this land and on behalf of NEADS, I would like to acknowledge the Indigenous peoples of all the lands that we are calling in from today. Our so-called Canada is built upon the ancestral and unceded territory of the Inuit, Métis, and First Nations peoples that call this land home. These unceded and unsurrendered lands were often taken through violent, non-consensual means, and colonial violence still persists in our society today. We stand in solidarity with Indigenous peoples across Turtle Island as they fight for their rights, representation, and recognition. With many of us being settlers on this land, it is crucial that we recognize our positions within oppressive structures and our roles and responsibilities towards reconciliation. Land acknowledgements like these are only a very small part of our lifelong, individual, and constantly evolving journey we must all take as we strive to improve relations between nations and to improve our own understanding of local Indigenous peoples and their cultures. To learn more about the land you're on, a link to native-land.ca will be provided in the chat box below. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Carly. I'm just going to sort of set the stage before Ravi and Ben start talking about their book, and to provide some context for this work that they've created. Eugene T. Kingsley led an extraordinary life. He was born in the mid-19th century New York. In 1890, he was a railway brakeman in Montana. An accident left him a double amputee and politically radicalized, and his socialist activism that followed took him north of the border, where he eventually was considered by the government to be one of the most dangerous men in Canada. Able to Lead traces Kingsley's political journey, starting with his time as a soapbox speaker in San Francisco. As a leading member of the California left, he ran for the US House of Representatives. After moving to British Columbia, he rose to prominence in the Socialist Party of Canada and edited its newspaper, the Western Clarion. Although never elected in political office, Kingsley shaped an entire generation of Canadian leftists. Ravi Malhotra and Benjamin Isitt illuminate a figure who wielded considerable influence in an era when it was uncommon for disabled men to lead. They examine Kingsley's endeavors for justice against the Northern Pacific Railway and how Kingsley's life intersected with immigration law and free speech rights. A little bit about the authors. Ravi Malhotra is a professor in the Faculty of Law and cross-appointed to the School of Rehabilitation Sciences at the University of Ottawa. He is the co-author with Morgan Rowe of Exploring Disability Identity and Disability Rights Through Narratives, Finding a Voice of Their Own. Benjamin Isitt is a historian and legal scholar based in Victoria, British Columbia. He is the author of From Victoria to Vladivostok, Canada's Siberian Expedition 1917 to 1919, and Militant Minority, British Columbia Workers and the Rise of the New Left, 1948 to 1972, among other publications. Malhotra and Isitt are also co-authors, or co-editors rather, of Disabling Barriers, Social Movements, disability history, and the law. Carly, I wonder if you could just quickly introduce Ravi for the next segment.
Of course. And now we will ask Professor Ravi Malhotra to share with us a reading of the prologue from the book. Thank you.
Thank you so much for having me. 30 years ago, I was an employee at NEADS, so it's a pleasure in middle age to come back to do this with my co-author, Ben Isitt. So I thought begin with extract from the prologue, which will give you a little bit of the flavor of the book. So this is the book from University of British Columbia Press that you can purchase directly from the website if anybody is interested. And I think the prologue gives you a little bit of the flavor, the writing. So second, okay. E.T. Kingsley was a master on the platform. Simple, direct phrases, master of repartee. This one instance that comes to mind out of many, and one will be enough. Whenever an election took place at that time in Vancouver, the Vancouver local of the party organized a debate or meeting between candidates. Almost always the other parties agreed to this. The boys organized the meeting, ushered it, did everything, took a collection, and thus got some funds to carry on their work. This particular year I have in mind, there was a conservative, was named Cowan. I think the liberal was Joe Martin, and there was an independent running besides E.T. Kingsley for the Socialist Party. This independent was a young lawyer with a good shock of curly hair, and as they drew lots as to the order of speech, this fellow drew the first one, and Kingsley was number 2. Well, the meeting opened, and this boy took it upon himself to tell the crowd that he would not attempt to deal with questions of history and economics and these deep matters. I leave that, he said, to my bald-headed friend. Well, the old man, and he got up, he had artificial legs. They'd been cut off on the railroad on this side of the line, and he would stand holding onto a chair, and he said, ladies and gentlemen, I've addressed hundreds of meetings on this side of the line and the other side of the line, and I've never found it necessary to refer to the physical characteristics of any of my opponents. But he says, this young squirt has taken it upon himself to make reference to my baldness, bald on the outside, and he points to his head. Then he pointed to the fella and said, and bald on the inside. You can see my kind of baldness every time I kick off my hat. His kind of baldness is evident every time he opens his mouth. That was old Kingsley, and I could tell you all kinds of stories about him. And that is from one of his comrades, W.A. Pritchard, giving an interview many years later about the life of E.T. Kingsley. And I thought that's a nice way to open this presentation, to give you a sense of Kingsley and his legacy.
Thanks so much, Ravi. That when I read that, I was laughing out loud when I was reading the book. I think there's quite a lot of, you're dealing with a lot of serious topics in this book, of course, because of the nature of Kingsley and his life, but there's also quite a bit of humor in it, I found. And it was really enjoyable to have moments like that about Kingsley and the kind of character he was. So what I'm going to do now is ask a series of questions, and I'll kind of go back and forth between Ravi and Ben. And then once that portion of this event is finished, we'll have a little bit of time afterwards for Q&A. And what I would suggest that people do if they have questions for Ravi or Ben, that they either put them in the chat or raise your hand, and then we'll identify you and allow you to ask your question. That'll keep things orderly. So the first question I have, I'm just going to sort of follow up with Ravi and then ask Ben a question next. So Ravi, what led you and Ben to research and write this book in the first place? What was it about E.T. Kingsley's life as a disabled political activist that most intrigued you?
Well, I should start at the beginning. Most people have never heard of Kingsley or the Socialist Party of Canada. This is a party that was largely popular prior to the First World War long before the foundation of the CCF. So it goes back a long way. And I was reading a book by Ian Mackay, Reasoning Otherwise, and I read a passage about him, about his political work as a leader of the Socialist Party of Canada, as editor of the Western Clarion, their newspaper, which we've spent so long, a decade, researching this book. It's been a very long journey for Ben and I. And I just became fascinated with him. And I wanted to know what were the circumstances. For a long time, after obtaining the SSHRC grant, I'm very grateful for SSHRC for funding this research that Ben and I have done with an army of researchers across Canada. And because Kingsley was American originally, including some based in the United States, wondered, well, are all the reports wrong? Does he really have a disability? Because it's only mentioned tangentially. And then one of our researchers one day found the site of his accident in Montana. He was a double amputee, but because he ambulated with artificial limbs, it wasn't very apparent. But it was clear that when we found evidence of his work, that he was an intellectual of the top rank. And we're going to be doing another book called Class Warrior, a collection of his writings that we expect should be out perhaps in the near future. And so we thought this was a great opportunity to do. And so the book came together because we found more and more material, and it brought elements of history and law. I'm a legal scholar. I have no historical background. I went out to seek a historian, and that's when I found Ben Isitt. And it's been a partnership that's lasted a decade. I bring the legal insights, and Ben has the historical insights. I bring the disability studies aspect. I dabble in it, and Ben has these immense research skills. And together we were able to put together this biography of Kingsley, and I'm very proud that we were able to tell his story, because it's a story that spans two countries. Kingsley was born in the 1850s, and he's a man who ran for both the House of Representatives, the legislature of British Columbia, and the House of Commons. And while he's never elected, disabled or not, there are very, very few individuals, I'm not sure there are many at all, that can say they ran for both the House of Representatives and the BC legislature and the House of Commons. So Kingsley has had an important legacy. I think it's very interesting and insightful. And it brought, because he was someone who was subject to the national security state later in his life as a radical, I was always thrilled to find the quotation, or a researcher, I should say, found the quotation saying Kingsley is one of the most dangerous men in Canada, an out-and-out red Bolshevik. This is from his security files when the security state ramped up. So we bring in national security law, we bring in immigration law, because Kingsley just showed up in British Columbia and started running for office. He was able to naturalize, and that speaks to the way, Caucasian men or white men were treated in that era. And also, in addition to all that, he sued Northern Pacific Railroad in the early 1890s. And as a legal scholar, I was delighted that we were able to find evidence of his litigation, even though we never found the outcome. It seems as if he never got a large settlement. But our research brought in these three areas. And I'm also very proud that Ben pushed me to have all these photographs, images in the book. So I was lucky enough to visit the isolated site of Kingsley's accident in Spring Gulch, Montana. And we have a photograph of that, of me at the site, but we also have many cartoons, captions. Kingsley was popular enough that at the peak of his popularity, he was featured in Vancouver newspapers in cartoons, and we were able to reproduce them. I don't know that any of this would show up on a Zoom call, but if people buy the book, you're able to see all these images. And so that's sort of an overview of the project.
That's fantastic. And what a great partnership that you and Ben have had in researching this incredible character and leader of the early socialist movements in the U.S. and Canada. And I also would acknowledge too, when you talked about him being a naturalized citizen or whatever, he never became a Canadian citizen, and they didn't find a way to kick him out of the country, which was interesting to me. Despite he was under watch as the most dangerous man in Canada at the time, or so-called. So I have a question for Ben. I found Kingsley's position on various things, including unions at the time, to be fascinating, considering what had happened to him as a railwayman and when he sustained his injury and became a double amputee. So how would you, or how should we reconcile Kingsley's so-called impossibilist Marxist socialism with its apparent opposition of the efforts of unions in the late 1800s and the early 1900s to improve conditions for working people who were often in very dangerous jobs?
Yeah, thanks. It's a good question. I think the most straightforward way to think about it is the distinction between reform and revolution. And Kingsley was clearly a revolutionary. He didn't want to just fix some things in society that were broken. He wanted to replace the existing society with a different kind of society and replace the social relations of capitalism with a socialist system grounded in equality. And so because many unions, both at Kingsley's time, but also today, are focused on fixing conditions under capitalism and making life a bit better for working people under capitalism, Kingsley thought that they were an obstacle to the socialist transformation of society away from capitalism. So I guess that's the most succinct response, that today we often think of unions, socialist parties as being in the same camp, and that's definitely true when we look at a world polarized between like fascism on the far right and revolutionary socialists on the far left. Unions and socialists are definitely very close together, and many trade union activists are active members of socialist parties. But when you start to split hairs about what is the path for change away from capitalist exploitation, to the trade unionist, it's that workers should form a union, they should fight the boss, they should fight for better conditions in their collective agreements, they should fight arbitrary actions and discrimination in the workplace, and they should also maybe engage politically for better laws. But from the standpoint of the revolutionary socialist, the task isn't, as it's sometimes described, rearranging the deck chairs on the Titanic. The task is to attack the entire system and replace it with something better. So hope that answers the question.
It sure does. And what a fascinating character. Basically, he wasn't willing to give an inch, right, when it came to his principles, and that was this guy Kingsley, old man Kingsley. He was often called, right? He was.
When you look at his speeches, which Ravi referenced, we hope to publish within the next year in a collective volume called Class Warrior. Particularly later in his life, these speeches, it talked about the sweep of human history in terms of like a 10,000 year time frame. And we often think what's going to happen next week, next month, maybe next year. When we think of First Nations, they often talk about 7 generations. So maybe that's approximately 150 to 200 years. For Kingsley, it was this 10,000 year arc of how humanity had developed as a species and what kinds of systems and oppressions had been formed. And he actually said he didn't think that capitalism would be abolished in his lifetime. He said that capitalism had emerged about 200 years before he was alive and organizing politically. And he estimated that it would take approximately the same amount of time for humanity to lift itself out of the conditions of capitalist exploitation. So he predicted that it would be 100 to 200 years after his life that humanity would emerge from capitalism. We're now almost 100 years after Kingsley's death. So maybe it'll happen in the next decade. Maybe it'll happen in the next 110 years, according to Kingsley's timeline. timeline.
So he was a real visionary, and he felt that he was playing his part towards a solution or an end that he wouldn't likely live to see. That's really quite amazing.
Yeah.
That's fascinating. Thanks, Ben.
You
Ravi,
bet.
I have a question for you. The book is really, to me, it's an incredible kind of tapestry, as it touches upon different subjects with respect to disability, race, gender, the law. You were talking about all sorts of issues relating to the law, and of course, there was really no sort of consideration at the time of disability law per se and human rights law. And so in touching on all these different areas, as these things affected Canadian and American workers in the early industrial age, Kingsley was clearly a complicated man in his own views on many issues. Can you talk a bit about this in terms of how he saw some of these different subjects in his own life and his own activism?
Well, in a lot of the media interviews that we're doing to promote the book, people sometimes want to know specifically what Kingsley's views were on disability rights. And of course, that's an anachronism. This is a man, as Ben said, died, 100 years ago, almost. He died in 1929. And one of the challenges of the book is that Kingsley is not a man who left a diary to our knowledge. We've not been able to find personal documents. We have a small degree of correspondence, level of correspondence, I should say, or collection of correspondence, but we don't have a voluminous set of ratings where Kingsley articulates what he thinks, and he seemed to have been very reticent to talk about his disability. And what's interesting about being an amputee, and this is a little bit like the work on Franklin Roosevelt, the former president of the United States, is that it seems if you met Kingsley, it wasn't really apparent that he had a disability because his limbs, artificial limbs, were not visible. And so in the book, we talk a little bit about the history of prostheses and some of the technological changes around that, and how there's a long history. I think a lot of modern disability rights advocates are not familiar with how far back that goes and the way in which prosthesis manufacturers used ideas of masculinity and productivity to encourage people to get these tools, these prostheses back. But it seems as if you were a casual observer, you wouldn't necessarily know that Kingsley had a disability. And so Kingsley's political organization talked a great deal about workplace accidents. And in that sense, I think there's work on disability, but it's not the modern sense of disability rights. We wrote about Kingsley because he's an interesting intellectual that had a disability. It's not to say that he himself was an advocate, as the national coordinator, Frank Smith, referred to. On gender, Kingsley was particularly backward. He wasn't someone who was an enthusiast of the suffragist movement, and certainly was criticized for that at the time. If you look at the early debates in the Socialist Party of Canada, I think Ben could probably say more than I can about that, but Kingsley was not the most radical person on those questions. And so this is an era before women had the right to vote. He became disabled in 1890, and he started running for the House of Representatives for the Socialist Labor Party in California in the 1890s. So, on all these things, he was not the most radical. But interestingly enough, on questions of race, the brief ratings that we do have on it, he does seem to have spoken out to some degree on questions of race when he commented about the disenfranchisement of African Americans. We have, and certainly when Class Warrior comes out, as we hope, we'll be able to reproduce some of these ratings in depth because it's a collection of his work. But I hope that gives you an overview, sort of, of his views on disability, race, and gender. And I don't know if Ben wants to add anything to that.
I think that covered it, Ravi.
Yeah, I think one of the things that I thought was really quite illuminating about the book with respect to race and how the socialist parties that he belonged to handled that and how he handled it himself. It seems to me that there are a number of instances where he supported, there were a lot of Chinese and Asian workers in the mines and things like that, and who were often being openly discriminated against. And from what I read in the book, there were times when he came to support those workers. And I mean, I think of it even in the context of how Asian Canadians and Americans are being discriminated against right now in a totally different history for different reasons. But yeah, that's great. Thanks for that answer. So Ben, you know, as a historian, must have been fascinated and also challenged, I guess, by the level of kind of meticulous research that had to be done on this fellow Kingsley, because you know that kind of the information on him was not, you know, it's not like plastered all over the internet, because he was a man who lived in the late 1800s and early 1900s. So I'm sure that you and your research assistants who were working with you and Ravi had to delve into all sorts of libraries all over the place and find paper records of newspaper articles and things like that. What was that process like, working with your research assistants on this project?
Yeah, it was, on the one hand, it was very helpful. It was the first project I've done where I haven't primarily done the primary research myself, or at least the first run of it. So previous projects, I was in the archives. It's interesting, archival research has shifted, and Ravi did some for us as well, being based in Ottawa, some later research at the Library and Archives. And as he now knows, it's heavily based on digital photography. You consult, archives often have very restrictive hours. And so when you're in there and when you have the documents in front of you, it's less about interpreting the documents for information that's relevant to the project and more just about gathering and taking photos of a lot of pieces of paper. And then once you're back at your office, it's a later stage of reviewing those materials and incorporating them into an analytical narrative. So yeah, the research, there was about 16 research assistants at one time or another. Some of them went through literally tens of thousands or definitely thousands of documents.
Wow.
Others did more limited research. And we divided up, we had a rough division of labor for the different chapters, although we both worked on all the chapters. And then at the final stage, there was a lot of work reviewing all of those materials just to make sure we hadn't missed some relevant information. So by the end, because it was all digital, it was basically reviewing digital folders. So there, we cite from more than 24 newspapers. So just going through, in some cases, we have literally thousands of articles from individual newspapers. So yeah, reviewing a lot of material, skimming a lot of material, and then adding them. As you can see, with about 1/3 of the book being endnotes, that reflects all of the sources that we looked at. And the challenge is to have a book that's readable and accessible while still being grounded in a strong evidentiary foundation. And I think we've succeeded in doing that, or I hope we have.
You certainly have. I can attest to that. So was there any, with the research, meticulous research that you did and delving through thousands of documents in all sorts of libraries on either side of the border, was there like an aha moment for you about Kingsley, for you, either Ravi or Ben, where you found out something about him through this research that just totally shocked or surprised you?
Can I go ahead, Ben? Or that? So some of it is vicarious because we're managing RAs, right? I mean, it's the prologue that I read for the NEADS audience comes from one of my research assistants. She was delighted to find this passage, and there's thinking, because in the quotation, Pritchard says one story is enough, and then she's like, I wish there'd been more stories. But I certainly remember when I was in Minneapolis doing research, and I had found the network of the Northern Pacific Railroad Hospital. And for those of you that aren't historians, it's kind of shocking to think that Kingsley was treated in a railway hospital. That tells you that there are constant injuries on the railroads. The fact that the Northern Pacific Railroad has not one, but a network of hospitals along the line, that speaks volumes to what working conditions were like. People talk about workplace injuries in 2021, but it's nothing like being a brakeman, which was Kingsley's occupation in 1890. This is an extremely dangerous occupation. And so, I mean, I myself did have moments personally in Library Archives Canada, finding material relating to the national security state, you know, but I think the biggest was when one of our RAs filed the litigation, the details of the accident, and then eventually we found the litigation, because we have a shirt grant. We've got a shirt grant on a lark, in a sense, in that the project will be a lot less interesting if Kingsley turns out to not have a disability, the reports are all wrong, or we just can't find the details. But to actually find, you know, the gentleman, Patrick Kraby, found the material that shows the accident, and we're the ones, to my knowledge, I don't think historians before had found that, this obscure place. And then I had the pleasure of actually going to the site of the accident, and so we included in the book. And so I don't know, I assume people can't see this, but if I hold it, this is me in Spring Gulch, Montana. And Spring Gulch, Montana is a very hard place to reach. It's I'm not somebody that has a driver's license, but even if you did, it is not near anywhere else. So I mean, one of the takeaway points I get, and I'll turn it over to Ben, I know I'm going on for a while, but one of the takeaway points that I realized by going there is how incredible it was that Kingsley survived his injuries, because he was a double amputee, and we did some work on the history of medicine in this book, you know, but so I'm not sure, I think we talk about this, I'm not sure x-rays had even existed at the time. I think x-rays come in a few years later. Imagine having surgery in a time where x-rays don't exist. I mean, this is really early days for orthopedic surgery. And so in one sense, it's a real miracle that he survived, that they were able to get him from Spring Gulch to Missoula to the hospital, and that he was able to learn to walk with prosthesis and go on to become this radical in California, you know. And so we have a whole chapter that outlines this. But my takeaway point is that, you know, discovering the injury.
That's astounding. And I'm so glad that you returned to Ottawa, because I understand that your travel agent originally purchased, or had you purchased, a one-way ticket to Spring Gulch, but you managed to find your way back, although you were enjoying the nightlife there and everything that quaint little place has to offer. Yeah, that's incredible. And reading about those railway hospitals, having hospitals deliberately built near railways, because the expectation is that not just hundreds, but like thousands of men, mostly men, would be injured or killed working on the railway, and also the resistance of the railway companies to implement changes that would make the workplace safer, including, I think it's like the resistance to automatic or automated whatever couplers for the trains. I may be getting that wrong, but yeah, that to me was really something. So I think not having X-ray equipment, for example, meant that in almost every single case, if there was a serious injury, there was an amputation involved, right? So yeah, that's really something. So I have another question here, and then after that, if we have time, and we should have a little bit of time, we'll turn it over to the people who joined us today to see if there are questions and comments for Ravi and Ben. So it's really interesting that you mentioned the various professions that Kingsley was involved in through his working life, because of course he had to earn a living, and he had to, and some of his living, of course, was earned through speeches and through the socialist parties that he was involved in. The names changed so often, it's hard to keep track. So his working life included, of course, the period of time that he was a railway man, where he sustained his injuries and permanent disability. But he was a printer, he was a fishmonger, he was kind of an entrepreneur in the forestry business as well. Would you consider Kingsley to be, at least I did, but would you consider him to be an entrepreneur and in that way a capitalist himself? He was against capitalism, but was he kind of a capitalist himself?
Yeah, once he got to BC, definitely. And it's been, we talk about it in the book, and some other scholars have looked at it. And Ravi, I think, had the important insight that for people who are disabled, there's fewer options within the capitalist economy and labor force. And so his sort of migration towards self-employment probably reflected the limited options after he became an amputee. So earlier in life, he had worked as a farmer, and he had worked at various occupations in the railroad. When you think of railroading, you think you're a rail worker, but there was actually something like 16 different occupational categories. If you think of just the layperson's idea, there's an engineer driving the train, there's a conductor who's kind of like some ways like the director of an orchestra, who manages the schedules and the passengers and the station stops, and then various Kingsley being a brakeman involved in coupling and starting and the various braking devices on the trains, but also all the maintenance of the vehicle, of the engines and the cars, but then also all of the maintenance and construction of the lines, the road itself. So he'd done several different types. Fireman was another job, helping run the engines. But then later, after his impairment, we don't find him doing physical labor, although his work was quite physical in terms of the literally hundreds of speeches that he gave. But primarily, he was a political organizer. And so a lot of his income for the 30 years after his disability was coming from political organizing. So from the dues that members of different political parties would pay, or donations, collections that would be given if there was a public lecture, and other income streams from the political parties. We looked in detail at census records, but also at city directories, which were sort of like telephone books that had more information. And so his occupation in some of those records was listed as a librarian, but that might have been a lot of these socialist political parties, because of their focus on education, had quite extensive libraries. So he could have been a librarian at the party, essentially headquarters, and given that as his occupation. He came to BC basically on an employment contract. It was our sources are somewhat ambiguous, whether it was a 1-month contract or a 2-month contract, but he had been working in Seattle after leaving California, and he was recruited by coal miners on Vancouver Island to come to Vancouver Island and give some speeches and help them organize their socialist party, which at the time was called the Nanaimo Socialist Club. And so he came on that basis as basically a paid political organizer because of his reputation for public speaking and his effectiveness of getting working people organized into socialist groups. And he ended up staying permanently. So he came over as a paid propagandist and organizer, but then in the city directories, they list his occupation as a fishmonger. So it's sort of out of the blue that he's running this business called the Nanaimo Fish Market at the same time that he's working, in all likelihood, much more than full-time hours as a political organizer. So it's a bit, but that seems to be his first move into entrepreneurship. When he moves to Vancouver, his main occupation is running the party newspaper, which was called the Western Clarion. And he was the publisher, the editor, and the printer. And so his business, the printing plant that he owned, also did a lot of just ordinary printing. So a lot of printing for unions and other just commercial printing jobs. So his political publishing was closely related to his commercial printing business, and that seemed to have been his main occupation and business for much of the period until his retirement and then death.
Yeah, and the Western Clarion itself had like a great fluctuation in subscribers, right up to like 15,000 or whatever a year, down to like a third of that or something, and that he was even putting his own money
Yes.
into the Western Clarion to keep it going, right? Because which was quite admirable. Did you have anything to add to Ben's reflections there, Ravi?
No, I think Ben really summarized it well. I mean, Kingsley was a man, he moved from profession to profession, but I think Ben has said it all.
Perfect. Well, now we have a little bit of time if people are willing to provide some comments or ask questions of Ravi and Ben. So I'd ask people to either put the questions in the chat or to raise your hand if you'd like to speak and ask a question.
And Frank, I'm going to switch to a mobile device. I have to make my way to an in-person meeting. So I'm going to be en route, but I will listen attentively to questions my way, but probably just participate with the audio because I'll be on a different device. So
perfect. Well, thank you so much, Ben.
You bet. Good to see everyone, and happy to continue the conversation now. And if there's any follow-up questions, you can send them to Frank and Ravi and myself.
And we will have the video available too.
Excellent.
On our
Thank you.
YouTube channel soon. You can use that to promote.
Perfect. Thanks.
The chat today. So Carly has a question.
Sorry, Frank, just clapping for Ben as he made his way to audio.
Okay.
Thank
Well,
you.
that was a clapping emoji. It wasn't
Welcome.
a hand up. Awesome. Okay. So other people, comments, questions? I see there's a comment from Ann Turner. Love the enthusiasm, Ravi. Much the same I feel when I find things that relate to my research on art-related subjects. One of my muses in art is Emily Carr, and to have visited her home in Victoria and meet people who had known her. That's fabulous. Other people have some comments or questions that they'd like to ask. I have a question. So Ravi, you are planning on publishing some of E.T. Kingsley's writings. When do you expect that book might be coming out?
That I cannot tell you. I mean, we're in the process of negotiating with a publisher. And so, it may be a year from now, but I would not be able to give you a firm timeline on that.
And a follow-up question to that, which is unrelated to the question I just asked, if you could just tell people again where they can purchase the book and the formats that it's available in currently and upcoming.
Okay, so for the month of June, there's a 50% discount if you buy it at the UBC Press website, University of British Columbia Press, and you can buy it in hardcover. That's very expensive. You can buy it in paperback, but that would be a pre-order. The actual paperback copy will not be delivered to you, I think, until December, but you can also order it as in the e-publication, which would be instant, and you can get it at Amazon at a very cheap rate if you want to buy it as a Kindle. So there's actually 4 ways in which you can buy the book. So it really depends on whether you want a hardcover, a paperback, an e-publication, or a Kindle.
Well, that's fantastic.
And
UBC Press is pretty quick in delivering. When you order from them, they deliver the book quickly and package it nicely as well.
Well, the other thing, before I forget, I wanted to mention that if people are interested in learning more through SSHRC, which we gratefully acknowledge, we were able to fund a website, which is mentioned in the book, but I don't think we mentioned it here. And in fact, on our website, we have documents related to Kingsley, and we also have posted a video of of our official book launch, which was held last week. And so in that we had Professors Brian Palmer and Jeffrey Riome, both of whom are very famous. Jeffrey Riome is a very prominent disability historian. Brian Palmer is a very prominent labor historian known to many Canadian academics and students. And so if you want to see that, as well as documents, primary documents about Kingsley, a whole range of things, audio tapes, but also textual documents, all you have to do is click on able2lead.ca. That's able to lead, all one word, .ca. And you can see the video, you can see these primary documents about Kingsley. So I encourage you to check out our website.
Yeah, well, I'll make sure that when the video is available and we're communicating afterwards with information about the video's availability, that we put a link to that website in the communication. I think that would be a good idea. And of course, you shared it with people here today as well. So do we have other comments or questions? Clearly, your talk was very comprehensive, Ravi. It covered all of the most cogent issues about the Kingsley book and your research. All right, so I think I'd just like to say that I'd like to thank Ravi and Ben very much for joining us today and speaking about this excellent book. I really recommend it to people. I purchased a copy myself and have thoroughly enjoyed it. One of the best books I've read in a long time. And it's certainly thorough and it's beautifully written and researched. I'm really looking forward to reading the end notes. I haven't quite got there yet, but anyway, it's a fine piece of work, and I congratulate you, Ravi and Ben, for that. I'd like to thank as well Carly for her part in this event and for the land acknowledgement off the top, and also for Carly and Alan for a little bit of behind the scenes management of things. Really appreciate that. I appreciate members of the NEADS team who've joined us today as well. Other members of the team, that's great. And we'll have other events. We have one coming up on Friday. So I encourage people to register for that event. Totally different subject. Elizabeth and Janique will be leading that and facilitating that event on the transition from high school to post-secondary education with a couple of excellent speakers as part of our new virtual access for all 2-year project, which has been funded by Employment and Social Development Canada. So on that note, I think I'll ask for the recording to be stopped and we'll end the event.